Okay, Julie, can we get a sound check? Does that sound okay? Hello. Does it sound okay? Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I This is going to be to me a very exciting in one way, but we've learned when we start a new book, the first chapter or two goes fairly slow and it introduces a lot of people, so you begin to get overwhelmed. So I'm going to give you a heads up to that. We've done so many books, but this one is our first post foundational what Gladio is. And we're going to examine just how widespread it is and if we can see it in other contexts. And this book, One Nation Under Blackmail by Whitney Webb, is going to be a great test of that. Because obviously, it's just like anything else. If you can try to make situations fit into a concept, we don't want to do that. What we want to do is present facts and see whether or not they line up with what we've already set the foundation to be. So I'll get back to the book in just a second. I do want to comment because I've been asked several times privately about the bin Laden letter. So I saw that letter obviously a long time ago. I saw the letter when it first came out. I was transitioning from CENTCOM into Air War College, and was involved while I was at CENTCOM, obviously after September 11th, in the whole impetus to create what ended up being a war machine. So, what I think is going on, first of all, things that we've learned. Let's see if we can apply some of them. When you have hundreds of people, all, even if it's 50 people, all come out and basically say exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, particularly on the same app, something's going on that's not organic. Somebody didn't just discover that letter. That letter's been out there for a very long time. That's number one. Number two, what app did they do it on? TikTok. What app does our country want to ban? TikTok. Now, as you can see on when I correspond with people on True Social, a lot of people still find it very difficult to think outside the box. So I'm not saying communism is good. It is not. But we've been lied to about every single country and about every single thing going on inside of every single country, okay? Our government lies. So you can't pretend that the one thing that you wanna hang your hat on, whether it's organ transplants or Israel can't do anything wrong, is the one thing they're not gonna lie to you about, okay? So I'm not going to say what is true and what isn't. What I am going to say is that you have to step back from every single situation that we are going to be presented with from now until it's over and examine it for what it actually is. So these ditzy people that they have going exposing this bin Laden letter to me is like sheep dipping. When you take something that is a fact in that we have been involved in some heinous activity overseas and at home, which is a fact, then you sheep dip that fact in TikTok die and then do it in ditzy women acting like they're all of a sudden international experts on how the US government has interfaced with our foreign adversaries. And all of a sudden, they're going to talk about international politics or international strategy or whatever. You know, right away, something um, they're being put up to that. So I don't think anything about it's organic. I don't think they just stumbled across this letter. I think they're probably paid to do what they're doing, which is propaganda. So if we take the fact that we've done some really heinous things and we dip it in, and there's no better example, and thank God whoever it was that turned me on to it did, than the Laurel Canyon where they took legitimate anti-war protesters that all looked straight-laced, wore ties, dressed nice, middle-class family going to college, and sheep dipped the anti-war movement in hippies and rocked out crazy um, rock and roll music scene in Southern California as if to um, and that's what they literally call it, sheep dipping. So I've completely changed the narrative of a serious conversation about why the hell we're in the war in Vietnam to, oh, that's just a bunch of drugged out LSD hippies that are trying to destroy America, because we're the big bad, we're going to save the world against communism. So don't pay attention to those anti war protesters. The original anti war protesters were not hippies. They were very well educated, middle class people who didn't want to go die for opium fields. So that to me is what's going on with this Bin Laden letter in the middle of the Middle East blowing up. Um, you have them actually exposing truth and that we've done some really heinous things, but they do it in such a way that everybody's going to disregard it because number one, it's on TikTok, and number two, it's a bunch of um, people that don't have any credibility in that field. So that's my opinion of the latest iteration of propaganda. So I'm going to move on from that. Um, I did promise that I would address that, and those are my thoughts. So we're going to, with that having been said, we're going to get into our book. Um, so the premise of this book is obviously how blackmail has affected our country. And a subtitle is The Sordid Union Between Intelligence, Organized Crime that Gave Rise to Jeffrey Epstein. So, if y'all recall, and I'm going to throw this up here real quick, I'm going to share my screen here. That's always very dangerous for me. Not because I have anything bad on it, just because I'm doing something that I'm not normally. Um, all right, so this is a diagram, very simple, that illustrates kind of the Gladio operation. So we've got the um, you grow any place they want to grow poppy, there will be a war because the war in the military protects the poppy. It also brings weapons into that area that they can skim off the top over here. It also provides the security and the aircraft and ships needed to transport the poppy. So that's why we go to war. Then they take those poppy fields, heroin, they sell it, they launder the money. Part of the money that they're laundering goes into paying for the stay behind units that has to do with Gladio operations. And they use the Gladio operators to take down nationalist, conservative leadership in coups, just like they did on January 16th here. And then you just repeat the circle. So human trafficking and blackmail all comes up here because in addition to selling drugs, they sell people. And they sell people and launder that money, and you see how we go. So, this needs to be modified because up here, you also have the human trafficking aspect of it. And blackmail generally has to do with human trafficking. So, whether or not the the human is a child or an adult, they use those compromising situations to um, uh, blackmail people. And I needed to set the stage in order to show you where in the so obviously her intro sets the stage with the fact that you have Jeffrey Epstein that got arrested. You have Ghislaine Maxwell that got arrested. Obviously, we know none of their customers that were buying underage people were arrested. And you had some very high up, like Alex Acosta, who had to resign as Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration because of his sweetheart deal that he was told he had to give because the um, Epstein was involved in intelligence, and they couldn't afford for him not to be quote unquote on duty. So, I mean, that's basically the story. Um, there were other Leslie Wexner people involved that we're going to get into in depth, but this is just a big overview of the book. Cindy McCain saying that everybody knew what Epstein was doing. And Epstein has very visible ties to Israeli intelligence as well as US intelligence, which we will go into. We also know about him having visited the Clinton White House and that Mark Middleton was the one that was signing him in. And we know that Mark Middleton ended up shot and hung. I don't know how you do that, but well, I do know how you do that. And it's not a suicide. So people that have been around, just like with everything that we've seen, there ends up at the end of the story a lot of dead bodies. And that obviously is going to be the case with this one as well. So when we're looking for patterns, those are some of the things and the correlation to whether or not any of this is in relationship to Operation Gladio. Because keep in mind that one of the um, uh, areas that we talked about in Operation Gladio was Belgium. And Belgium is the one that had the guy, Dutro or something like that, that actually was literally trafficking in children and only children, and not just for sex. They were using children in the woods and hunting them down with rabid dogs. So these people are sick. And we've discovered all of that as it relates to Operation Gladio. So if you haven't um, done any of the former book reviews, you need to do those in between of this, kind of binge watch them so that you can get caught up. Because people who are just coming in now would be going, well, nobody would do that. Well, they do it all the time. So and she draws the ties back to World War II. Now, I can tell you, I've already read both of these books, that she does not in any way use the words Operation Gladio. Um, I have on Twitter reached out to her a couple of times in areas where I see the direct overlap to let her know that is what it's called. Um, haven't heard back from her, but I don't care. We're plugging on ahead. Um, and then obviously, just like we saw before with all of the DEA arrest in Operation Gladio, every time that um, somebody would inadvertently arrest one of the CIA people in a drug sting, they get told, oh, you can't arrest him or oh, you can't prosecute him because it's national security, which national security just means that you'd out the CIA doing bad things in our name. So, um, she makes the point that obviously Epstein is just the tip of the iceberg. Um, and then she includes a quote, which I think is very interesting, from a former CIA officer and Iran Contra whistleblower by the name of Bruce Hemmings from 1990. Who are these people? He writes, they are the group that is popularly called the Enterprise. And those of you who've been with me for a while, I call it the International Syndicate. He goes on. They are in and outside the CIA. They are mostly right wing Republicans, but you will find a mix of Democrat mercenaries and mafia and opportunists within the group. They are CEOs, they are bankers, they are presidents, they own airlines, they own national television networks, they own 6 of the 7 video documentary companies in Washington, D.C., and they do not give a damn about the law or the Constitution or the Congress or the oversight committees, except as something to be subverted and manipulated and lied to. They abhor sunlight and love darkness. They deal in innuendo and character assassination, planted stories, just like the one we just talked about, and incomplete thought and sentence. They burn and shred files if caught. They commit perjury. And when caught, they have the guaranteed get out of jail free card with large US corporations. If you let them, they will take over not only the CIA, but the entire government and the world, cutting off dissent, free speech, free media, and they will cut a deal with anyone from the mafia to Saddam Hussein if it means more power and more money. They sold $600 billion. They stole $600 billion from the savings and loan and then diverted our attention to the Iraqis. They are ripping off America at a rate never before seen in history. They flooded our country with drugs from Central America during the 1980s. They cut deals with Haro in Mexico, Noriego in Panama, and the Medellin and Cali cartels and Castro, and recently the Red Mafia in the KGB. They ruin their detractors and they fear the truth. If they can, they will blackmail you, sex, drugs, deals, whatever it takes. Unquote. That's who we're dealing with. And that's a great summary and a big kickoff into the book. So, chapter 1 is called The Underworld. And most of this is going to be a refresher course because she goes back to the 1946 and some earlier times, but primarily the OSS and the formation of the CIA, which we've already uncovered in our other Gladio deep dives. And she talks about how they set the stage for the mafia and the intelligence apparatus of the government through a uh, arrangement of the threat in the New York harbor of the German U-boats. And they use that. Um, so it just for those who don't know, a fire broke out on a boat called the Normandy, and that was in New York City's harbor. And she basically sunk, and they used that as a scare tactic to say that we have to work with the dock workers, which, by the way, were all controlled by the mafia, in order to get the security of our harbors under control. So that's kind of where she starts this book with the Office of Naval Intelligence opening an inquiry in 1942 and the possibility of U-boats, and a guy by the name of C. Radcliffe Happington, who happened to be working, had worked with Thomas Dewey, who was a U.S. state attorney, who's later going to be the governor of New York, um, to secure the New York City waterfront. So they approach the business agent of the United Seaworkers Union in Fulton Fish Market. And he basically says, you know, hey, I'm just low man on the totem pole. You need to go talk to Meyer Lansky, who's a mafia guy. So Frank Costello's involved in this, and they all say, hey, we're kind of the low men on the totem pole. Who you really need to talk to is Charles Lucky Luciano. But Thomas Dewey had already imprisoned him for prostitution, and so they're going to have to go visit him in prison. So they do, and hence gets birthed Operation Underworld. Operation Underworld is where they begin working with Lucky Luciano in order to not only secure the New York harbor, but he also is involved in opening up what was at the time the non-existent mafia in Sicily because Mussolini had outlawed the mafia and had basically decimated. He had done to the mafia what the mafia had done to Italy in the past and basically kind of just annihilated them all. And again, this is another good example. Does that mean I love Mussolini? No, it doesn't. It just means that Mussolini did some good things. He got rid of the mafia and he also got rid of the Masons. He condemned every Masonic lodge, said if you were found to be a member of a secret society, that it was going to be obliterated with you in it. So take that for whatever it's worth. I'm not pro Mussolini. So, shady alliances. Lucky Luciano was born in 18, so funny reading this now, 1897 in Sicily. He came to America in 1906. Um, he formed his own gang at a very young age, which offered protection to Jewish immigrants from Italy, and he also helped organize Irish. Oh, he was protecting the Jewish people from the potential Irish crime elements for a small fee, extortion, in other words, at a very young age. He formed an alliance with another youngster slash gangster, Frank Costello, an immigrant from Calabria, Italy. So they started basically organized their own crime syndicate with prostitution, narcotics, and even organized labor on the New York City docks. And he's propelled to all sorts of heights. A lot of his workers get prosecuted, but he manages to escape. Um, and Dewey is quoted as saying, "Business was far flung and brought in colossal revenue. This was estimated to be far, far in excess of $12 million a year." And I mean, this is back in the 30s and early 40s. That's like rock star status. So they basically, for the first time, Luciano's growing criminal empire of Italian, Jewish, and now Irish criminal networks are all intermingled together. And so, for the first time, he comes up with the concept of kind of having them all work together. And that created a lot of problems for law enforcement. And it spread everywhere. They have people in Chicago, they have people in Las Vegas, they have people in the Caribbean, all over Cuba. They basically took over the Cuban island. And again, just for the new ones, I'm not pro Castro. The mafia had taken over Cuba. They were prostituting young girls, and there were crime everywhere. The nationalists in Cuba are the ones that began the revolution to get Batista, who was bought off by the mafia and the US crime elements, out of office. And the CIA was using Cuba as a staging point for their heroin network into the United States. And yes, it was the CIA doing it. So, under the auspices of the mafia. So the CIA did not want a revolution there, and they actively fought against the nationalists trying to kick the mafia criminal element off their island. Well, the CIA and the mafia lost, and the nationalists won. Did Castro take over that nationalist movement and become a dictator? Absolutely. I'm not pro Castro, but he did get rid of the mob. You have to acknowledge facts. So onward. So there is set up a Luciano Castellano Lansky Siegel alliance that became better known as the National Crime Syndicate. And it took on like a social network as well because they lived together, they partied together, they went on vacations together. It was a very close knit organization. And so Dewey prosecutes Luciano and throws him in jail. And later, he works with John Foster Dulles, and he tries to secure the nomination for the Republican Party for president. Dulles was a member of the internationalist camp, which we know that, because I refer to him as part of my international syndicate, and also a part of the Eastern establishment, which was another word that it went by. And Dewey ran on the Republican Party. What Dulles got in exchange for his support of Dewey was he eventually ends up as Eisenhower's Secretary of State, which we have already talked about. So, an investment that Dewey, who, in all intents and purposes, when you first read when you first read anything about Thomas Dewey, you get the impression that he was a good guy. Whitney has found some information that in the 1950s, there was an organization, a business called Mary Carter Paint Company. It was later renamed as Resorts International because, paint companies becomes entertainment, but only when you're dealing with the mob. Mary Carter was controlled by a family by the last name of Crosby, and its operations were overseen by James Crosby, one of the sons. Mary Carter was deeply tied to the organized crime network. It worked closely in developing businesses in the Bahamas with Meyer Lansky frontmen. James' brother Peter Crosby was a notorious confidence man with an impressive roster of criminal contacts. So it's also, based on what you're reading, alleged that Mary Carter is basically a CIA front company, which, given the context of how it's uh, set up, does lend itself to be a CIA front company. So, hold on just a second. Let me turn my ringer off. Um, so we're just going to leave it at that. But Dewey was involved in that. And did Dewey get partial shares in that company because he ends up releasing Meyer Lansky? Because he does. He releases, not Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano. He releases him to go and help organize during World War II the onshoring of the Allies into Sicily for their run up the Italian peninsula. And there could be a correlation that that's what he got in return for his. I'm not saying it, it is a possibility. So she talks a little bit about the OSS being the forerunner to the CIA, and that there was a lot of overlap between who ended up in the OSS and the mafia. An author by the name of George White says um, that there's federal testimony that um, Luciano was um, trying to protect the OSS in some of his testimony that he gave, and that according to another historian, Earl Brennan, an OSS officer in Italy, quote, was kept in the loop regarding negotiations between Luciano and the ONI. And that's just to document that there's actually evidence that Luciano was working with naval intelligence. And she says, quote, the OSS has many things operating in many different theaters. In Europe, it ran a fairly unsuccessful paramilitary campaign. Now, I'm going to, and I tell you when I do this, I'm going to differ with her. She says it was a fairly unsuccessful paramilitary campaign because she doesn't know what Operation Gladio is. Those of us who know what Operation Gladio is and understands that their paramilitary campaign was to set up stay-behind units that were going to be useful for them for the next, what are we at? 60, 80 years. I think it's been very successful. They've overturned governments, they've gotten prime ministers fired. So you can say it looked lackluster because all they were doing during the time frame of the OSS days was setting it up. It's paid big dividends for them. But she goes on to cover what they did in the Southeast Asia, China, Burma, India, and talks about how successful that was. And I'm going to argue because they needed that immediately to pay for what they were doing in Europe. So, again, just for clarification, they grow opium in China, in India, and in the Southeast Theater, Burma, eventually. So they needed that immediately and they needed immediate results because they were going to use the drug money profits to pay for what they were setting up in Europe. So, and it's it's pointed out that OSS was seen as a social club because what you find in the OSS at that time was a lot of the country's elitist, wealthiest people in London, Madrid, Geneva, Paris. Like you have people like the Mellon family from Pittsburgh that was owned Gulf Oil. You had the heirs to the Morgan family. You had the DuPonts and the Vanderbilt. You also have um, other families because keep in mind the reason why you get rid of nationalistic leaders like in Cuba is because Cuba's not going to give you their oil for free. If you buy off Batista, he's going to let you drill wherever you want because he's getting rich and he don't give a shit about the people that live in his country. That's what happened with Pinochet in Chile. That's what happened in Argentina. That's what happened in Venezuela. It's what happened in all of the countries where they've assassinated or couped the leader. They do that to rape and pillage the wealth of the country. And so if you're a nationalistic dictator or president that might be a democracy, as if you don't want your country raped and pillaged by these people, you won't be president for very long. So the business, it's not coincidental that you find these wealthy elitists in the OSS, in the CIA, um, because they're going into these places. That's why they volunteer to be on the Red Cross. That's why they volunteer to be on all of these NGOs. They go into these countries under the auspices of some philanthropy opportunity to do well when all they're doing is stealing resources. So, what the one that was not noticeably in the OSS was the Rockefellers. However, the Rockefellers had their own organization called Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. David Rockefeller, Nelson's brother, also had basically his own intel apparatus and didn't need to participate in the OSS. So the she credits the Wild Bill William Donovan as the creator of the OSS, who at the time was a New York City antitrust lawyer and veteran of World War One. He also had very close ties, like Dewey and Dulles, both of them, um, because he was one of the Eastern Establishment insiders. Um, So his job at the time before the OSS was working defending trust and different groupings of companies in the corporate area. He was a internationalist, both personally and politically. He looked out for corporate interest. He traveled to Russia on the behalf of the Morgans to collect information just prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. If y'all remember, if you've been with me since Anthony Sutton, um, Donovan was in the Red Cross, um, which was not medical or anything to do with Red Cross as we know it, grouping of like 30 people that went over and basically cased the country for resources prior to starting the Bolshevik Revolution. So Donovan was appointed by President Roosevelt to head what was originally called the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI. COI was basically the seed to get the toe in the door to create the OSS a little bit later. And while it was supposed to be a clearinghouse for intel, it immediately began with military and political propaganda. And also, a guy by the name of William Stevenson, spelled with a PH, who was a British intelligence operative out of MI6, ends up helping Donovan set up the OSS. And you realize when you read this stuff that after they created the Fed in 1913, we basically were recolonized, just as a heads up, because they have their fingers in everything, the British government. Okay, so you have the British Security Coordination, which is called the BSC, and there's a guy there by the name of Stuart Menzies. He was the head of the MI6 at the time, and he tasked Stevenson with, quote, establishing relations on the highest level between Britain, SIS, which is the Secret Intelligence Service, and what did they run? Operation Gladio, and the US FBI. Stevenson and the BSC operated from an office located in Rockefeller Center's International Building. So I wonder who Rockefeller's Independent Intelligence Organization was. Oh, they're sitting right in his building. So Stevenson also worked closely with the Special Operations Executive, which was Section D of MI6, which was another known collaborator on all Operation Gladios that happened in Europe from our previous book. Okay, so Stevenson had a very close working relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, and the British provided the FBI with over 100,000 confidential reports because that was Five Eyes before Five Eyes, where they spy on our people for us. Hoover and Stevenson would ultimately have a rift between them by the 1940s. And that's at the point where Stevenson started working closer with William Donovan, which obviously would have been a thorn in Hoover's side because as soon as OSS and then the CIA was set up, the FBI and the CIA were button heads all the time. So that just kind of adds to that fuel. And it also allowed people like Meyer Lansky to blackmail Hoover, which we will get into in a little bit. Um, so, according to Whitney, Stevenson basically was cultivating Donovan to basically work for the British interest as well, if not overtly, at least covertly, as opposed to just doing what's best for the US at the time. So, and a lot of people think that's how we ended up getting into World War II. So Donovan conferred closely with another guy by the name of Robert Sherwood, who was a playwright, ardent interventionalist, which is an internationalist, and close confidant of President Roosevelt. He was so close to Roosevelt that he wrote a lot of Roosevelt's speeches, and he was sharing them with Sherwood. Excuse me. Sherwood was sharing them with Stevenson and Donovan before he even gave them to Roosevelt. Think about that. That's crazy. Um, so the the British security group undertook a propaganda campaign at garnering support for the American intelligence apparatus. Why? Because they wanted to have one here doing what they were doing in Britain, and they wanted under their thumb. So Vincent Astor, who was one of FDR's friend and a New York coordinator for intelligence, was probably says that he was probably a plant to build consistence for British intelligence working with our um, our government. And he also identifies a George Feeling Eliot as a devoted British sympathizer, one of the most influential people in the British Security Office, a subgroup called Fight for Freedom. And they even mention here the fifth column, which we learned about when we talked about the Spanish um, Gladio being people that are embedded in your country that's going to not work on the country's behalf, but become a fifth column to the opposing forces or working with the opposing forces. So it's funny, we just learned about that and then it's in this book as well. So they're basically trying to say that they're doing everything to oppose that Nazi fifth column, which we know is just a basic lie. Um, At that time, there was no evidence that there was a Nazi fifth column. They just want to set up their own intel agency so they can spy on everybody. And the other lead into that is when you need intelligence, whether you're the mafia or doing all of these illegal things, having the intel that you need to carry out your mafioso work embedded in the government and coming with the full weight of the government is much better than operating outside the government, right? Because you can claim national security. So basically, what you find happened is they're, they're, they took the mafia and put it inside the CIA. That's as clear an illustration as you can say. Many of the same people that were working in the mafia worked at OSS and later worked in the CIA or for the CIA. They basically embedded an intel apparatus that conducted criminal activity under the auspice of a government and then hung a shingle saying, you can't see in here because it's national security. So for the last 80 years, every criminal act that the mafia got away with was under the label of national security embedded in the CIA, in a nutshell. That's what the purpose of Operation Underworld was all about. So she goes on and talks about how he got deported, and there's a whole bunch of people. I'm not going to go through all of the names because it does get a little cumbersome. There's a couple I want to mention. Um, Frank Coppola, who also was a powerful Detroit mob boss, he got deported alongside of Luciano, and um, he also was linked to Jimmy Hoffa, Teamsters. Hoffa and Teamsters also worked very closely with the CIA, particularly in the efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Um, and in 1947, there she talks about the May Day massacre in Sicily, which killed 8 people. We know for a fact that was a Gladio operator from Operation Gladio by Paul Williams. So these same people that we're talking about in here are conducting Gladio operations when they get to Italy. Also deported was Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, a Sicily-born mobster that had been operating in New Orleans. He had close ties to the New York organized crime network. He also worked with Huey Long, and he set up slot machines all over New Orleans. He established centers of communication and money laundering operations on a national scale to be headquartered in New Orleans. They created 3 large Las Vegas style gambling casinos in Louisiana. Another guy that was involved was Carlos Marcello, who was also involved in the Louisiana casino operation. And he got tapped to take Corello's place when Corello was deported. And that kind of sets up all of the different kingpins around. She talks about uh, Trafficano here in a little bit too. Um, Drug connection and Operation X. So I talked a little bit about this in the post that I did about China's Green Gang being implicated in part of the drug operation that she's painting the picture of having been set up. We're very familiar with the drug setup, having already done several of these book reviews. She wants to talk about the China Green Gang specifically, um, and because it does have today repercussions. The Green Gang began long before the 20th century dawned and has its roots in a secret uh, Luoism folk religion that deals with Buddhist and mystics. And their leader was Lu Menghog, or excuse Hong, Ming Hong. And if you guys remember, along when we first started talking, when we did the Anthony Sutton book on aspects of Hitler and those and his crew, we talked a lot about mysticism and the Buddhist influence on many of them. And this is ties into that network, and this is where they learned that mysticism both in India and in the western part of China, and that's where we're talking about here. So, the leaders in China did not like this mysticism, and they basically suppressed it and drove it underground. And because of that, the Green Gang became known as crime syndicate because basically the only way they could get food and everything was black market. So they begin dealing in drugs, black market weapons, black market food, black market everything. So they bring to power uh, KMT, which stands for a group by the name of Kuomintang, later known as Nationalist Chinese under the direction of Chiang Kai-shek. And we've talked about him because he was the nationalist that the British in the US was supporting until they weren't supporting him, and allowed the communists to take over China. Had they continued supporting him, and I'm not saying he's good or bad because I don't know. He was a nationalist. He believed in China, not in communism. And we supported him for a long period of time. And then we cut off all weapons to him. And that's when the Chinese took over, just like we did in Vietnam. So the Chiang himself was not a member of the Green Gang, but his mentor was. So that's his affiliation with it. The Green Gang were fully integrated into the government of Shanghai. Why is that important? Because we learned the Opium Wars netted the British Empire, both Hong Kong and Shanghai. So it's telling you right here, because we know this now, that this nationalist and this gang is set up in British occupied Shanghai using their banking system, HSBC, blah, blah, blah. And it's all dirty. So the Green Gang begins conducting espionage activity and political intelligence for the government of Shanghai, which by default is the British. And they also suppress trade unions slash communists. Now, why is that important? Because the trade unions would be in opposition to British, and we can't have people actually representing themselves. They have to be under the imperialism of the British Empire. So they're not allowed to vote. And keep in mind, as we go through this, KMT, that entity that Chiang is the leader of, is the element that when communism takes over, he claims rightful title to the president of the Republic of China and moves to Taiwan. That's the current, and still today, KMT is the political entity that's basically ran Taiwan all of this time, or Formosa, as I pointed out. So understand that when we talk about, oh, we're going to go to war over Taiwan, you're going to war over a country that's ran by this nationalist guy that they left stranded 80 years ago in favor of communism. Okay, moving on. So prior to KMT's rise to power, Chinese opium production was unorganized and distributed among different sparring factions within China. Chiang, a suppression was carried out with the goal of bringing all of the opium trade under his control. So behind the scenes, well, he said he was wiping it out, but behind the scenes, the suppression was to get everybody else out of the business except for him. Oh my gosh, that sounds just like what we did in under Nixon in the war on drugs, right? Everything repeats itself. So Nixon's war on drugs was to get the French out and turn everything over to the Sicilians that we set up in business, that was doing business with the CIA. So it was just to get the competition out. So that's what KMT is doing. They're under the auspices of getting rid of it because it's a bad thing, only to turn around and be the only one in control of it. That's a Nixon move. Well, I guess Nixon got the move from KMT. And ironically enough, wasn't it Nixon that went to China? Oh my gosh, it was. I'm sure that's a coincidence. KMT's opium monopoly came from the Western modernizers, including Rockefeller Foundation, who went over there and created in 1910s China Medical Board, because of course they did. Rockefeller Foundation undertook efforts to promote modern science and develop educational programs and set up hospitals, so they can control it. And the foundation's support for opium created a monopoly under the guise of a health crusade. Gotta love these people. Rockefeller sought regulation and control over the global trade. The League of Nations formed an advisory committee on traffic of opium and other dangerous drugs. It worked closely with the Rockefeller Foundation, because of course it did, and created an imperative of the League's effort to create a global drug regulation that rationalized the production of opium to consolidate drug refining and distribution. Because, again, what did I just tell you? These industrialists that are part of the international syndicate want to be part of this so they can go in and control the resources. This just happens to be opium. China simultaneously kowtowed to the League's initiatives while using the monopolization drive to cement itself in the drug production pipeline. It became a full blown narco state in the process. And I'm going to say it again, and y'all can get pissed off if you want. By our turning China under Chiang into a narco state, you drive people behind the communist effort, just like they did in Cuba, to get the infestation of Western criminals out of their country. That's how you promote communism. You turn their country into a narco state like we did Cuba and like we did China, and you grow communism. So we get to um, American organized crime figures arrive in China and begin organizing the lucrative global narcotics network. The first to arrive was Arnold Rothstein. Now, I didn't look him up. So if Julie, that's Arnold, and you spell his last name Rothstein. I looked up a bunch of these. I just didn't get him looked up. He was a mentor to Lansky, Luciano, and Costello. He dispatched a whole series of people over there to basically take control of the narco state. So another guy, one of his guys by the name of Katzenberg, was a high level in the New York Jewish crime syndicate, and he controlled the distribution of heroin once it hit New York. So he went over there as part of Rothstein's setup just to organize stuff. There were secret heroin processing labs that were set up to accommodate the opium flow from Asia. So you have American organized crime, the KMT, Green Gang dominated Chinese opium trade that um, also set out and incorporated another very powerful Western industrialist. Well, kind of Western. Actually, it's referred to. I think they came from India. The Sassoon, Sassoon family, that are referred to as the Rothschilds of the East. The Sassoon family had emerged as economic administrators in Iraq before organizing one of the dominant opium trading complexes in the East. One fifth of all opium brought into China was shipped on Sassoon ships. Thanks to opium, they became the wealthiest family in India. Yeah, that's what I thought. They were from India. They also had the largest real estate holdings in Shanghai. They had investments in oil, um, which eventually became part of the British Petroleum holdings. These people were basically operating under the auspices of the British Empire. In the 1800s, the Sassoons competed for dominance in the opium trade with Jardine Matheson, which was an organization that was in Hong Kong, again, another territory of the British Empire. Um, so, as late as 2013, the Financial Times reported that Lord James Sassoon, having just finished a stint serving as the commercial secretary to the Treasury in the UK Prime Minister's office of David Cameron, became an executive director to the Jardine Matheson board. So these are current day players. they were not only involved in opium, but anytime you are involved in the drug network, you also will be involved in intelligence because the only way you are successful at trafficking drugs is to have your own capability for intelligence to not get caught trafficking drugs. They go hand in hand. That's the same thing with human trafficking. So, anybody like an Epstein that's human trafficking, it goes hand in hand with the fact that they will be part of the intelligence apparatus because they can't do it without it. So, you have Henry Keswick, Keswick, who basically served on at Jordan Matheson and was the controller of many different organizations to include HSBC. There you go. HSBC, we learned, is a drug money laundering bank. That is its primary business. And he also was part of the municipal council in Shanghai. Two of Henry's sons, John Henry Keswick and William Johnston Tony Keswick, served in the Chinese theater as part of that UK Special Operations unit, the SOE. He's and y'all remember the Lord Mountbatten that was the child molester? Keswick was his personal aide. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with what personal aides do, but you literally do everything for those people. I was an aide. You get up first thing in the morning, you're with them the entire day, and you don't go to bed until they do. So there's nothing in the child pedophile realm that Mountbatten guy could have been doing that this aide guy didn't know about. Tony Keswick crossed paths with what was the precursor to the DEA called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So there's a guy that worked for both the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and as an OSS operative by the name of Garland Williams. And the two of them worked together. Williams was dispatched by Preston Goodfellow, a former Hertz executive, the media, who had become a William Donovan's special assistant because there's always going to be the propaganda. After meeting the British spy master Keswick, Williams returned to Washington with the SOE's training manual to help establish OSS training schools in Maryland and Virginia. Now, let me tell you why that's important. We've already established that SOE were the people that were responsible for training gladio operators in the European theater. So now we have the people responsible and their training manuals coming home to Maryland and Virginia to train newly assigned OSS agents in gladio. Tony Keswick returned to the world of corporate affairs, taking a position in one of the family's companies in London. He became the governor of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada. The Hudson Bay Company was central to the rise of the Brofman of the Seagrams fame and featured a lot in the Q drops for people that are into that. So they have both legitimate and criminal ties. So like with everybody that's in this underworld, they money launder into legitimate businesses, which is exactly what the Brofmans did. Through his acquisition of the SOE training manuals from Keswick, Garland Williams played an essential role that paralleled the higher levels of cooperation between William Donovan and Stevenson, which is the British counterpart. Williams appeared to have operated at the intersection of American intel and American organized crime and the British Empire and their intel. So you've got anybody that was in the Shanghai area that was in the OSS or the British intel were all in the opium deals. So in his book called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, author Peter Dale Scott theorizes that the existence of a formation that he provisionally dubbed Operation X, Williams and other veterans of the basically the precursor to the DEA were brought into the OSS and CIA and identified the apparatus. And here's a quote from his book. The intelligence mob collaboration established with Operation Underworld did not end in World War II. On the contrary, post-war narcotic operations overseas were subordinated to anti-communist activities. Semicolon. I'm going to stop right here, guys. When we go through this book, every single time in your future, if you read the words anti-communist activities, that's Operation Gladio. Just get that in your brain, reprogram it. When you see anti-communist activities, they are talking about Operation Gladio. This guy doesn't even know that he's talking about Operation Gladio. We all know that. He dubs it as Operation X. It's called Operation Gladio. So he says, quote, post-war narcotic operations overseas were subordinated to anti-communist activities. They weren't subordinated it, they funded it. They funded Operation Gladio. He goes on. And they were used as a cover for ongoing use of mob assets, above all drug traffickers around the world. In developing these post-war mob contacts, White and his FBN, the precursor to DEA, associates, notably his former supervisor, Garland Williams, and his protege, Charles Saragusa, even while formerly back in the FBN hierarchy, functioned as a counterintelligence unit attached to the CIA and at times the Army. Because it's Operation Gladio. In the 1950s and 60s, it would appear that the FBN systematically subordinated the prosecution of drug cases to a second hidden agenda, the use of traffickers as agents against communism. See, I could have just short circuited that and just said this whole setup was Operation Gladio. That's because you and I are all in the know now. Don't y'all feel so much smarter? We can read this stuff now and actually um, translate it into real world. All right. So the author Scott cites, quote, selective arrest made by George White in a 1959 heroin case involving the anti-communist, which means Gladio, pro KMT, which is the Chinese nationalist group of drug runners, Hip Sing Tung or gang. White, an agent for the FBN and OSS, who was a contractor for the CIA after the war, had busted a heroin ring operating out of San Francisco that tracked back to the KMT gang and then subsequently identified the heroin as originating from Chinese communists. Not really, because the communists weren't selling it, but whatever. White himself had a history with the Hip Sing Tungs. In 1936, he infiltrated the notorious Hip Sing Tung Brotherhood of Seattle by masquerading as a drug dealer, leading to a massive sting operation that nabbed some 30 drug dealers. It's worth saying a bit more about George White, Whitney says, because he has ties to the American intelligence apparatus as well. And she gives the different names. They're not all that important. They don't show up a lot. But basically saying that the greatest importer of manufactured Chinese opium into Europe came from this organization. And when White brought in one of these guys to the CIA, the FBN agent was himself being recruited by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who was working at the agency's Office of Technical Service. Gottlieb oversaw the CEA's research of truth drugs, sweeping inquiries that dealt with the effects of the drugs, shock therapy, sensory deprivation, hyp, hypnotic drugs, and esoteric current on the human mind. These programs were labeled MK Ultra, saw the CIA become the largest consumer of LSD in the world because they administered it on unwitting and witting subjects, psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, private citizens. Under Gottlieb's direction, CIA ran safe houses were established in New York City and San Francisco where unsuspecting people were dosed with hallucinogenic substances, and they used two-way mirrors to watch their reaction. And we already know all about the whole San Francisco and giving them to college students and prostitutes and watching them have sex and all that other stuff. That's all covered in here. And Gottlieb was the guy that ran all of that. So in 1955, Harry Anslinger, the commissioner of the FBN, transfers White to San Francisco to fill a post for the FBN supervisor there. And he ends up working with Gottlieb and the CIA as part of the MK Ultra subproject 42, which was labeled Operation Midnight Climax. So, using surveillance. And what's interesting, not interesting, but um, the CIA we know is not supposed to be doing any of this stuff inside the United States under any circumstances at all. And yet we know they did, and we know that Congress never did a damn thing about it. There's another guy by the name of John Gittinger, who was a Harvard psychologist who was also on the CIA payroll that was part of all of this as well. White wasn't alone in obscuring the role of the KMT in the drug trade. So was Harry Anslinger. And those people kind of worked together with Garland Williams, who we just read about. So Anslinger, like Donovan, were enemies of J. Edgar Hoover. And they basically used the McCarthyism and the anti communist movement here to claim in the, let's see, they claimed that the Communist Party what had overtaken the vast opium fields and that it was the Communist Party that was supplying all of the opium, which we've just articulated that absolutely was a lie. The people that were providing the opium was not the Communist Party. It was Chiang, who was funded by the Brits in the United States, that was providing all of the opium via the Sassoon shipping and other Western Rockefeller medical entities. So you have to stop and think for just a second. Where's the fentanyl coming from? Where's the fentanyl coming from? Because they lied to us. Oh, did somebody just say that? I bet the Gladio people. Oh, you did. Quantum, you're awesome. Yeah. So that's exactly right. So I'm telling you right here unequivocally with evidence who was behind it. And our government is lying to us back then in the 50s and 60s, telling us it was the communists doing it. So Anslinger did not have any agents located in Asia in the post-war years. FBN didn't go over there until 1962. The claims made by Anslinger in the 50s were sourced from intelligence provided by KMT, who were the opium drug kings. So you've got these government officials using the propaganda from the drug source saying, "Oh, it's not me, it's these guys over here that's trying to kill me." So that they could then generate anti-communist hatred, deservingly or not, against the communists while it was them doing the bad things. Overseeing this intelligence web was MacArthur's protege, a fascist sympathizer by the name of General Charles Willoughby. Willoughby, we talk about in chapter 5 in a little bit more in depth, but the China lobby is a domestic political pressure group that we're going to do a deep dive into. We did a little bit already. It's a very interesting topic. And the author that come up with the concept of Operation X said that there was a dual function served. First, it bolstered Cold War propaganda against communists and the fifth column, but it also helped hide the roles of who was actually doing it. And that's true, but the operation, Scott, is not X, it's Gladio. So, also, she starts talking about the possibility of J. Edgar Hoover being blackmailed, and that was being done to obscure the role of KMT in the drug trade because there's no way that the FBI did not know the source of where this drugs was coming from. So the long-term effects of the OSS apparatus was to set up the China India Burma theater during the war. The apparatus had then concentrated its power in a unit called Detachment 101, which incidentally, she points out, had been set up by Garland Williams, the same Garland Williams that are lying about who's supplying the opium. Can't make this shit up. So, you also have a guy that we've become very familiar with, E. Howard Hunt, the CIA coup master who's over there at the time. You also have John Sieglub, Singlaub, who's a major player in an upcoming, which we go into, Iran-Contra affair. There's also Paul Helliwell, who we know very well because Paul Helliwell was very much involved in Operation Gladio and the setting up of the money laundering capability because he owned a bank. And in 1943, a guy by the name of William R. Pierce, Peers, leads the CIA's first training program, became head of OSS Detachment 101. Carl F. Um, Eichler, sorry, um, got hurt during one of these training things, and so William Pierce replaces him. Pierce subsequently becomes the head of OSS operations in the China Burma India theater. Personally oversaw the commando operations carried out by the KMT troops against the Chinese Communist forces. Piers later reflected on his OSS years in an autobiography, saying that discussing payment issues needed to finance the OSS operations in Asia made a startling disclosure. Quote, simply stated, paper currency and even silver were useless as there was nothing to buy with money. Opium, however, was a form of payment everybody used. Not to use it as a means of barter would spell an end to our operation. Opium was available to agents who used it for a number of reasons, from obtaining information to buying their own escape. Any indignation felt was removed by the difficulty of the effort ahead. If opium could be useful in achieving victory, the pattern was clear. We would use opium because they have no ethics. The OSS activities in Burma would lay the groundwork for the country's subsequent act as an essential node in the Cold War activities and, of course, in the drug trade. The After Chinese communists drove the KMT out of the mainland and into Taiwan, Burma became the main outpost. The CIA organized a secret army with prospective plans to invade China, although the KMT was to fail in its military operations, it did succeed in expanding the opium trade. And basically, it just goes on to say they basically just moved it. They moved it to Burma and to Laos and Taiwan, and they ended up increasing the production by almost 500% by relocating it to these other areas. And I also want to mention, since we're talking about how this all relates to current day, for those of you who are not geography whizzes, Burma is modern day, um, uh, not Miramar. Help me here. Where they just where the military just overthrew the illegally elected president. Oh shoot. Um, when y'all are going to get that? Um, anyway, look up where. Yeah, there you go. It is Miramar. Okay, so the issues that are going on there are directly related to what we're talking about. They were infested with these people. So she goes on and describes the fact that Thailand was an integral player, which we've already talked about in our previous Operation Gladio network. There was a company called Southeast Asia Supply Corporation called CSEA Supply. Willis Bird acted as the C Supply Bangkok office manager under the direction of a guy by the name of Sherman Ju- Juiced, a veteran of the OSS Detachment 101. C Supply was not set up in Thailand. The business was registered in Miami, Florida, and it was oversaw by lawyer turned banker Paul Helliwell. Helliwell handled all of the legal end for C Supply, even though it was operating in Thai. And remember from our other book, Helliwell doubled as the Thai consul in Miami. Talk about dirty. Um, Sea Supply worked closely with Civil Air Transport, CAT, which is the precursor to the CIA's Air America. So before Air America was Air America, it was called CAT. The roots of CAT were planted in the Second World War, where Claire Chennault organized, and he's a general, organized the Flying Tigers, which were a volunteer aviation element that provided support for the KMT in China in their fight against Japan. The Flying Tigers trained at bases in Burma, which was their logistic hub. And you see how this overlaps? So you've got all of these cargo planes coming in and out, bringing in equipment and flying out drugs. Chenault had served as a military advisor to Chiang and his brother in law, who also was a nationalist Chinese banker and diplomat called TV Soong. So Chenault and his wife becomes avid members, like very vocal, of the China lobby. Thomas Corcoran, a top advisor to FDR's New Deal, was very close to Paul Helliwell, and Chenault is very close to Paul Helliwell. So they lobbied for the support to KMT as the only viable group to oppose Chinese communism. They managed and to shift supplies and create an airlift to um, under the auspices of American Relief Supplies into China. The supply flights contract went to Chenault, and he got very wealthy off of it. And the new airline was called Civil Air Transport that Chenault co-founded with Whiting Willauer, Willauer. Willauer would go on to be the US ambassador to Costa Rica. Oh my gosh, and was there during the 1954 CIA-led coup in next door Guatemala. When the KMT retreated to the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, Chenault used CAT to run arms and medical supplies to the national Chinese fighters. So basically, they're doing military operations under the CIA or OSS at the time. CAT was brought into the world of special operations thanks to the effort of Helliwell. He had brought Chenault and the aviation company to the attention of Frank Wisner, who we know very well. He was in the Office of Policy Coordination, which was originally in the State Department, and then he moved over with it to the CIA. The CAT was a full-fledged CIA proprietary airline operating under the auspices of a holding company set up by the agency called Airedale, Airdale Corporation. Airedale became Pacific Corp, and then CAT became Air America. Air America was CIA's premier airline from the 1950s to the 1970s. And here's a funny story. So when this whole operation basically moves over to Vietnam and basically stays intact when the poppy fields started moving around. And at the end of the Vietnam War, a lot of the Air America assets started getting sold off. And guess where they went? They went to a company called Evergreen International Aviation. And as it turns out, when I got off active duty in 1985 for my ROTC scholarship to go to school at Indiana University full time, I went to Indiana University Southeast in the New Albany campus in southern Indiana, which was across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. I worked in aircraft maintenance for the 6 years that I was on active duty. For the 2 years that I was in ROTC, got my A&P license and worked at Stanford Field for UPS. And guess who contracted maintenance to UPS? Evergreen. I worked for Evergreen International Airlines for 2 years on the ramp at Stanford Field. Now, I've talked to several people who flew for Evergreen. Evergreen 100% did CIA flights. They flew drugs. I'll never forget this because I mean, I just spent all that time on active duty and maintenance, and I my first I was walking with the guy that was going to be basically my mentor. Um, we the aircraft flew in at 9 o'clock at night, all loaded. They had the huge sorting buildings there. Everything got offloaded. We did the flight check on all of the looking over anything, like if a light bulb was missing, whatever. No big maintenance was done at night. We just did small stuff. Um, if a tire blew on landing, we could change a tire. Then Once everything got shifted around and all the aircraft was reloaded, the last one took off like at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. So 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, crazy breakneck speed, debriefing all the pilots. They go off to the lounge. We do whatever maintenance needs to be done, check all the liquid levels, blah, blah, blah. And we do the pre flight, they go. And my first time walking up the back stairs after it had been offloaded, walking through the cargo thing, you come up to the flight deck and there's the door there, and on it is all of these pieces of paper. And I'm like, what the hell is that? So I start reading the stuff while he's talking to the pilot because they're not going to want to talk to me. I don't know what I'm doing yet. And I'm reading these papers and I'm like, Colombia, Guatemala, what the hell? This this has got what? What's going on? So when we got done and we're back in the truck, I looked at the guy and I'm like, because he was prior service too. I'm looking at him and I'm going, those aircraft are approved to fly in all of those countries. Do they do that? And he's like, yeah. Have you never heard of Evergreen? I'm like, evidently not. I had no idea what they did. I had worked there probably about a year before, a friend of mine, um, what had came to Louisville, that I used to work with, one of my old crusty NCO, buddies that had been in Vietnam, and he's telling me what this company does, and my eyes are like that big going, "Oh my gosh." Yeah, they flew CIA missions all the time. So anyway, also interesting is we had 4 3 kinds of aircraft. We had 747s, just a few of them, on the ramp at Louisville. Most of the ones that came in overnight was 727s, but we did have next day air, which were flown with DC-8s. When I got there, the DC-8s had all come from the Flying Tigers. The UPS had bought the DC-8s from the Flying Tiger Chenault outfit, and they were retrofitting all of the engines in Paris to upgraded engines. And so when I read this the first time, I oh gosh. And then several of the Flying Tiger pilots went on to create air freighter firm Flying Tiger Line, a major commercial cargo airline that operated with military contracts as well as CIA. The Flying Tiger Line would later have a major presence at Rickenbacker Airfield in Ohio, which is located with Leslie Wexner's The Limited. Let that sink in. So the airline that flies CIA missions, headquarters for all intents and purposes, is Rickenbacker Airfield, which is right outside of where Jeffrey Epstein and Les Wexner's operation is. And then in the 1990s, the rest of the Flying Tiger line was absorbed by Federal Express, minus the aircraft they had already sold in the mid 80s to UPS. So there's just a little personal inside information there. Connections to organized crime appear in every corner. There's a woman by the name of Margaret Chung, Chung, who was an attending physician for Chenault's Flying Tigers. She was also a member of Hip Sington. She made frequent trips to Mexico City in the 40s in the company of Virginia Hill, who was an inside player in organized crime circles with Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. Hill became intimate with a number of the Mexico top politicians, army officers, diplomats, and police officials. So basically, she's an intel asset. That's how you know that. She was particularly close to the Chicago outfit of the mob. Mexico had become an important base of operations for drug smuggling with Costello and Corolla. Mexico had become a a vital transshipment point for KMT's own drug trafficking during the same period. The presence of Margaret Chung alongside Hill then suggests that the KMT drug operations in Mexico was directly intersecting with Lansky and the mob and the KMT and the Green Gang, which then means the CIA, which makes sense because we already know about Operation Gladio. Civil Air Patrol, Civil Air Transport, the successor to the Flying Tigers, was by 1960 flying in and out of Laos, which was controlled at that time by the Hmong tribesmen. There was a major supplier, they were a major supplier of opium destined for refinement into heroin. Airstrips for the CAT flights were built by a private engineering firm by the name of Bird, BIRD, and Sons. They were controlled by the CAT representative in Bangkok, William H. Byrd. Byrd was the cousin of Willis Byrd of the OSS and Helliwell's Sea Supply Company. Nothing like keeping it in the family. Helliwell had become a prominent player in Republican politics. He was a delegate for Dwight Eisenhower when he ran for Republican president. Helliwell had been a leader in the Florida chapter of Citizens for Eisenhower. That chapter subsequently accused of being taken over by professionals who refused to work with the regular GOP leaders and who were accountable to no one for the finances they collected. The members of this cadre, aside from Helliwell, included Kurt Landon and James Gilmartin. Together, these three men were tightly connected to Helliwell's law firm, and Gilmartin was a partner of Helliwell's, and Gilmartin is married to Landon's daughter. So they all end up with a lot of authority based on money in Florida politics. So Helliwell gets involved in Florida insurance. He becomes a consul for and later secretary, then chairman of American Bankers Life Assurance, located in Miami. Helliwell utilized offices of American Bankers Life as a hub. He ran the Florida Thai consulate out of that address, and he also ran Sea Supply out of that address. The CIA linkage to American Banker Life also shared important connections, one of which was Helliwell and another bank called Miami National Bank. Founded with a loan from Teamsters Pension Fund, Miami National was identified in 1969 as having served between 63 and 67 as a conduit for syndicate money laundering that was exported by Meyer Lansky's couriers and laundered into a bank called Exchange and Investment Bank in Geneva. Helliwell's ventures closely flowed with the heroin network and passed through many of American organized crime figures. South Florida was a major refuge for Latin American flight money laundering, which pours into Florida banking systems and local real estate. The flight capital into real estate business is an old one. In the 50s and 60s, the KMT money from Thailand and Burma came via Hong Kong and was washed into Lansky's related property firms. And remember, Hong Kong is British, HSBC. The super mob The global drug trade is a massive business. She talks about, basically how without and I'm not gonna go into the figures and stuff, but her assertion, and it's well documented in here, is that we would have never survived the 2008 without the liquidity for all of the illegal money laundering that goes on in the United States because it's in the trillions of dollars. And she talks about these accounts being used in the Caymans, Bermuda, the city of London, um, all of the typical ones that we've came to know is involved in it. Um, and one of the telltale vehicles used is called private venture capital. Generally speaking, a large amount of those are money laundering opportunities. And she even gives some quotes, with Catherine Austin Fitts, who, is a favorite of mine, and she basically verifies all of that. Um, and then she goes on to talk about another way of washing money is capital into real estate. The KMT drug money flows into Florida. Explosive growth in the world economy in the decades following World War II allowed for that. The high-tech industries, um, modern tourism industries at building exotic resorts at particular locations, usually dealing with casinos as well, because they skim the money off of the casinos to further fund more illegal operations. Um, let's see. I'm trying to just hit all of the highlights here. She uses there's a guy by the an author by the name of Gus Rousseau who wrote a book called The Super Mob, and he's referring to a close knit circle of Jewish and Italian mobsters and businessmen who arose in the corruption ridden corridors of Chicago and who then installed themselves in California and elsewhere. The super mob created criminal networks, political power, and legitimate commercial activity mixed together in the wake of World War II. One of the key players was a guy by the name of Jake Avery, Avery. He started off as a fixer in Chicago's 24th Ward. Um, he was praised by FDR. He did work for Republicans. He switched to Democrats, as they all do, because 'cause they're uniparty, and became the best Democrat ward in the country, according to FDR. And Avery's closest associate was Henry Crown, who later became a major figure in the Hilton Hotel Company, the dominant controlling interest in the major defense contractor General Dynamics, and the owner of the Empire State Building. He subsequently sold the iconic building to Lawrence Wien Wien, a New York City lawyer, real estate developer who was helping manage the assets of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, which were controlled by Mo Dalitz, Dalitz. And this is where we get into a Ray Cohn connection, or Roy Cohn. Roy, Cohn. Now, when you look up Roy, he spells his name a whole bunch of different ways, but we're going in the book Cohn. Crown also was in business with a guy by the name of David Bayard, Baird, who ran a trio of foundations that moved organized crime and CIA money around. Crown's son Lester would later join a group called the Mega Group, which was co-founded by Leslie Wexner and Charles Brockman in 1991. And we'll go into detail in a later chapter about this mega group. But she's setting the foundation that all of this sits on CIA and mafia foundations. Henry Crown's business empire began with his company called Materials Services Corporation, a supplier of concrete and other materials during World War II. He joined the Army Corps of Engineer during World War II and created a relationship with Jake Avery. Avery, who would also join the armed forces, managed to become, in no small thanks to his friends in the Roosevelt administration, the overseer of the international post exchange facilities on military bases, of which used Crown's Material Services Corporation for their supplies. 1959, Material Services Corporation eventually merged with General Dynamics. They produced bomber aircraft, ballistic missile systems, cutting edge technologies, for the American military. Crown received 20% equity in the company, which made him the controlling stakeholder. His right hand man, Patrick Hoy, Hoy, was basically installed as the vice president of the corporation. Hoy had earlier been president of Hotel Sherman in Chicago, which was the watering hole for any event where outsiders came into the Chicago area for organized crime. General Dynamics became um, intricately involved in intelligence capability as well. In 1966, after leaving General Dynamics, Hoy became vice president of Penn Dixie Cement Company, the CEO of which, Jerome Castle, was best friends with New York crime boss Frank Costello. One big infested mess. Avery, Crown, and Hoy all had one Chicago lawyer named Sidney Korshak, Korshak. The Korshak family grew up with the Averys. Jack Avery, Sidney Korshak forged early working relationships with Al Capone, because of course he did. He was an advisor to the gangster. His subsequent law partner, Edward King, was a lawyer for Capone's heir, Frank Nettie, and they were partners in the Acapulco Towers Hotel because that's how they launder their money into real businesses. So Korshak lent his legal talents to arrange frontmen for organized crime in Las Vegas. So basically, what they did was they went out and found people just to register their names and paid them some amount of sum to sit on a piece of paper as the owner while it was really ran by the mafia. Another associate was Julius Caesar Stein, who was a doctor who gave up his doctoring to become a guy that booked all of the bands and singers in the speakeasies and nightclubs of Chicago. He founded MCA Records, and Capone and Stein were very close, working with gangsters in all the bars and clubs and music halls. Stein brought a man into MCA that basically shaped the entertainment industry forever, changed it. Lou Wasserman. Yes, of that Wasserman. Wasserman already had boasted a background in mob circles. He had been a publicist for Cleveland, Ohio's Mayfair Casino that was controlled by Mo Dalitz, Dalitz. Dalitz and Wasserman maintained lifelong ties. Wasserman married Edith Beckerman, the daughter of Dalitz's attorney, Henry Beckerman. Beckerman's name was listed on the club's liquor license. Wasserman and MCA's connection to organized crime is going to be discussed in depth a little later. Chicago mob basically began relocating. So, y'all remember where we talked about in Laurel Canyon, where the music industry went from the New York out to Los Angeles. We're going to watch the Chicago music industry migrate to LA as well as the mafia goes, both between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And when that happens and you're talking about the casinos, you have the skimming, which is another cash generating opportunity to launder more money. And you have the people involved, like Meyer Lansky, that are part of the whole casino mob. And then you also have them investing the illicit money into legitimate real estate. So the super mob, let's see, investments made by the super mob was a protege of Avery and Korshak's name, Paul Zephyrin, Ziffren. Zephyrin's granddaughter would later marry Lou Wasserman's grandson, all in the family. They also have bought interest into Hilton Hotels and launched a company called Store Properties Inc. And there's a whole bunch more people involved in that operation that I'm not going to go into because some of them will hit later on. This is just kind of the big picture. So, one of the people that are involved in all of this is a guy by the name of Guinness, Sam Guinness. He was a member of an organized circle of businessmen who helped provide the startup capital for a company called Committee on the Present Danger, CPD. It was a Cold War pressure group set up to build plans for the militarization plan of a constant global presence fighting the Cold War. These are the same national security documents that were referenced in the startup of Operation Gladio to give the CIA the cover to do what they were doing. Just FYI. Um, Part of this group had members like Crown, Hoy, General Dynamics, all part of the pressure group because they all stood to make money from it. The organizers behind this group were the movie producer Samuel Goldwyn and industrialist Floyd Odlum, Odlum. Odlum, a shady figure who is now largely forgotten. He was the man behind Atlas Corporation, and we ran into Corporation as part of our Operation Gladio too. He invested heavily in aviation companies, film studios, real estate, natural resources. They would later gain very lucrative government contractors or contracts in the uranium mining inside the United States. Odlum's interests were completely diverse. Through Atlas, his money seeped into Hilton Hotels, into United Fruit Company, and United Fruit Company is a CIA front company that Rockefeller was involved in. And remember, it was down in Guatemala where it owned like 42% of the real estate down there and didn't pay a penny in taxes. He also owned interest in Pan Am Airlines. Atlas had control of Convair, an aircraft manufacturer, which was sold to General Dynamics in 53. In in re in return, he got a large, portion of the General Dynamics stock and became a representative on the board. Um, that's where he overlapped with Harry Crown. So you have a California this is very interesting. California-backed formation of the CPD also had a number of very high up film industry figures like Ronald Reagan. Reagan was an MCA man. He had been represented by the company when it bought out the agency that had previously represented him. So Ronald Reagan's repped by MCA that was created as part of a mafia entity. Wasserman renegotiated Reagan's contract with Warner Brothers, obtaining a deal that paid Reagan $3,500 a week for 7 years. The deal was Wasserman's first $1 million contract making Ronald Reagan the first millionaire client in the movie industry. The rise of Reagan to the heights of political power in the US was facilitated in large part by Wasserman and MCA. Reagan was vital to the survival of MCA in Hollywood. Reagan, on Wasserman's request, ran for and won presidency of the Screen Actors Guild. During his tenure as being in charge of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan worked as an FBI informant and reported on people in Hollywood as a result of that arrangement. Reagan began to change the rules to benefit Wasserman. The Screen Actors Guild had previously restricted companies like MCA, i.e., talent agencies, from becoming producers. However, in 1952, Reagan granted the company a special waiver. MCA thus gained an insurmountable edge over competing agencies in Hollywood because now they could rep a person and put them in the movie as a producer, which gave them a huge edge. Reagan secured the governorship of California in 66, with MCA being a large part of his fundraising. He had people that worked for MCA on his campaign staff. Jules Stein went to work arranging funding, who was also part of the MCA staff. And basically, it was a standing joke in Hollywood that MCA had their own governor. Running against Reagan was the incumbent Pat Brown, who also they put money against just to hedge their bet because they didn't really care whether the person was a Democrat or a Republican. They just wanted to own them. And we know that to be a fact. So after being defeated by Reagan, Pat Brown took the directorship at a company called Investor Overseas Services, an international mutual fund with a connection to Meyer Lansky. He had been brought to the fund by James Roosevelt, one of the sons of FDR. James had organized crime ties of his own. He had done business with Store Properties, a mob-controlled real estate company that had been set up by Gifford and Jennis, who we just talked about. Also partnered alongside Roosevelt and Store Properties was James Swig, SWIG. He served earlier as Pat Brown's statewide finance chairman for his gubernatorial campaign. The Roosevelt boys seemed to have a penchant for fostering ties to the underworld. James' brother John Roosevelt had arranged for Jimmy Hoffa to get a job at Botch and Company in New York City, securities and stock brokerage that handled about 25% of the Teamsters pension, which was a $160 million investment. The president of Botch, BACHE and Company, incidentally, was Frank Ryan, a veteran of the OSS who was partnered with Spymaster William Donovan and other veterans of the U.S. and British intelligence in World Commerce Corporation, WCC. WCC also had a handful of firms like Atlas Company, Botch, which represented Odlum's brother-in-law, L. Boyd Hatch. So that's what I was telling you. If you start getting into all of these names, it gets very in the weeds, if you will. But you have to understand, without your eyes glazing over, just how interconnected all of these people are. Um, the next section is King of the Castle. And I think since we've been going, it's the last one. So I'm going to kind of skim through this so we can get this whole chapter done because this we then transfer into some of the more meaty stuff. And we know most of this stuff in King of the Castle. You've got Nicholas and Thomas Pritzker of Chicago, of the current Pritzker family. Um, and you have Penny Pritzker. You have all of them. They're on the CFR. They were behind Barack Obama's development. And They served Penny Pritzker served as the Secretary of Commerce. J.B. Pritzker, of course, was on Hillary Clinton's campaign. He becomes governor of Illinois. The whole thing's corrupt. They're part of the Rand Corporation, which is part of the CIA. Um, you have um, she talks about how their roots goes back to the uh, 1930s with the uh, what's the word? Running alcohol prohibition, um, and how they ended up all making money off of that. Um, the Pritzker family employed Burton Cantor as a tax attorney, and Cantor ends up getting on the Hyatt board. He's part of the CIA. He gets massive kickbacks based on um, the use of Prudential Financial. I'm just kind of highlighting these. You have, and probably the easiest way to talk about this is whether y'all know it or not, one of the big things is the use of um, unions, benefits, and municipalities, both state and local, benefit money. And they use that money as part of seed money to cover shortages in other areas. And so that's why the unions were always tied to mobsters and money laundering. So insurance, um, we made a joke when we were first in Operation Gladio that they all owned a bank, they all owned an insurance company, and they all owned a trust. And the trust can either be a private equity fund or whatever, but it's in the form of a trust. And if you meet somebody that owns a bank, owns an insurance company, and owns a trust, they're part of this. Um, you have to have all of those things in order to keep all your balls in the air at the same time. Money you launder your money. The trust is the front companies that you can set up to put the illegal money on the table and then launder it through the bank. So you really have to have all of it. And the insurance money is insurance fraud. So if you have bought a casino or you bought whatever and you need it to go away, you burn it and you collect the insurance money, just like they did with the towers. You need extra money, you own an insurance company, no problem. So that's kind of so I did want to bring up the Castle Bank aspect of this because she brings it up. And we know unequivocally Bank was created by Paul Helliwell and it is part of Operation Gladio. It was used in large part in connection with the Vatican Bank money laundering scheme of Operation Gladio. So what is interesting about it also is Cantor is involved in the operation of Castle Bank as well, and that it ties the Pritzker family to that bank as the largest depositors at the CIA Halliwell's bank in the Bahamas. While a number of people tied closely to them maintained accounts there, Stanford Clinton held money at Castle. Tony Curtis did, yes, the movie star. Sidney Korshak did. Playboy's Hugh Hefner was there. Um, and a bunch of the casinos had money there. Authorities had put a trail on Castle Bank in 71 after a man named Alan George Palmer and several of his associates were busted flying marijuana to Florida from California. And they found out that that guy was using Castle Bank to launder his money, and it exposed American National Banker and Trust Company in Chicago as well. So, but of course, nothing happens to these people. So, Castle Bank was basically a melding of all of these And what cracks me up is she doesn't make the connection, although Castle Bank has been wrote about in with regards to Operation Gladio multiple times. Um, it says when Castle was first established, it was just a paper company. It sat for 3 years from 64 to 67 before it was fully activated. Um, it had dealings with the Bank of Cutler Ridge and the Bank of Perrin. And let's see, I'm just kind of getting the highlights here. It also had dealings with the Inter Maritime Bank in Florida. And we come across a future CIA director, William Casey's friend, Bruce Rappaport, um, involved in this banking. The Bank of World Commerce was a Lansky controlled bank that was involved in this whole daisy chain of banks. Um, what else? It wasn't just only a repository and conduit for money to evade billionaires, shady businessmen, drug dealers, fraudsters, but it was eventually probed by the IRS, and it found tax evasion. It found tax evasion, but the investigation from the IRS was shut down. Because why? National security. Um, the DOJ launched a probe in 1977, and this is what it revealed. It now appears the pressure from the CIA rather than any legal problems was what caused the Department of Justice to drop what could have been the biggest tax evasion case of all times. Moreover, the supposed legal obstacle to using Castle Bank depositors list was questionable at best. The government already had in its possession the same list, legally obtained. What caused the Justice Department to back off seems to have been the CIA's argument that pursuing Castle Bank would endanger national security. So we're right back to where we started in the housing of the mafia apparatus and the underground in the house address of CIA allows them to do whatever they want, wherever they want, for as long as they want. And anybody that investigates gets turned off because it's national security. If you were a gangster, you would have thought you died and went to heaven the day the CIA set up and they started hiring all of these mafia connected people because that's literally what it is. Okay, so that's the first chapter. That was a lot. Thank you for sticking with us. And that's going to kind of seed the rest of the conversations. I'm going to go back over here um, and see if we got any other questions. Rosalind Carter just passed away. Oh, did she really? Well, that's interesting. Just reading the notes that Rosalind Carter has died. Um, what are the books on Laurel Canyon? All right, let me. I'm going to get you that reference in just 1 second. I'm going to post it in the comments. If y'all have not read this, let me just tell you. Um, this guy is crazy. Good. I mean, so this is the website here, Center for an Informed America. Now, in addition to the Laurel Canyon, he really tweaks your. He has um, the Lincoln assassination. He has a thing called Moondoggie. He has a thing called Boston, which is the Boston Marathon, Laurel Canyon, and 9/11. Now, I recommend you start off with Laurel Canyon because everything that you thought you knew about the World War II, the start of rock music, all of that other stuff, the Manson murders, all of that stuff, you don't know jack crap till you read this. What this guy does, I love his sense of humor. His sense of humor reminds me of my husband's. Um, he asks questions. He asks logical questions. And most of the time, you can find the answers to the question in his material, but he allows you to formulate it yourself by presenting you a whole lot of facts that none of us have access to. The same thing with the moon landing. He asked a lot of questions that really rankled some people who um, can't answer the questions. 'Cause if you could answer the questions, then why don't you just answer the questions instead of trying to shoot the person who's asking the questions? So I highly recommend y'all explore that because they're long. There's several. So the Laurel Canyon one is probably like 15 different segments. And so you can read three or four of them at a time. Um, but it will blow your mind. My husband and I, we got out maps. We were looking, there tunnel systems, there's houses that were connected, there's all kinds of people that it'll blow your mind. And it goes right hand in hand with Operation Gladio. Um, So, and we talked about the evergreen stuff. And Julie, thank you very much for posting all of the names so people could go look them up. Um, and the different references to everybody. I really appreciate that, Julie. Thank you so much. I don't know how I'd do this without you. Um, so, and Raven as well. Thanks for all the posts that you made and the stuff you found. Um, so anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for being here. And I already posted the schedule for the rest of the week. We're gonna rock and roll through this book, and it's gonna knock your socks off, I'm telling you, because it overlaps almost too perfectly with Operation Gladio. So, thanks for being here. I will see y'all in a couple of days. Bye.